Good evening. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, who will be speaking on the same subject that everyone else has been speaking on. Samuel Blumenfeld is the author of the monthly Blumenfeld Education Letter. He has written 6 popular books on education, including How to Start Your Own Private School and Why You Need One, The New Illiterates, How to Tutor, Alpha Phonics, a primer for beginning readers, and NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education. His book, Is Public Education Necessary?, has been described as one of the most important books on education ever written, and Fortune magazine called it a brilliant revisionist history. A frequent guest speaker on college campuses and national radio and television programs, he has taught in both public and private institutions, including a school for students with learning and behavior problems. 5 of the books that I mentioned above, or a moment ago, are in the library, and 5 of them are also on sale in the bookstore. So if there's any interest, please check them out. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld.
Thank you, Ray, very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be at Hillsdale again. This time, however, I have a special delight in being here. About a year ago, I was asked by Dr. Roche to come up with a curriculum program for a private K-8 academy, which he wanted to establish at Hillsdale. For me, it meant defining a philosophy of education that would serve as the basis of all the decisions that would have to be made in establishing and operating such a school. After a good deal of thought, I came to the conclusion that the sole legitimate purpose of what we call education is to pass on to the future generation the knowledge, wisdom, and values accumulated by previous generations, particularly by that generation paying the bills. On the basis of that definition of purpose, I worked out a curriculum outline, which I have been told has been followed by the Academy. Tomorrow I shall have a chance to visit the Academy and see how well we've succeeded. I shall report back to you my findings on Thursday at 1 o'clock in Phillips Auditorium. And now for the subject at hand, values in public education, the cultural Civil War. There is a myth extant among a significant body of educators in America that a teacher can be value neutral in the classroom. A corollary of that myth is the notion that a teacher must not impose his or her set of values on the students, and that the students must be free to develop their own values. The process whereby this takes place is known as values clarification, and you've heard a lot about that so far. Values clarification, the means whereby the student works out or discovers his or her own set of values based on his or her desires, experiences, beliefs, and interpersonal instincts. The first question that arises from this view is, how is it possible for any living human being to be value neutral? Indeed, what does value neutral mean? In classroom practice, it has meant bringing up moral issues for discussion among the students, with the teacher remaining mute, refusing to interject his or her views. Somehow it was expected that through the enlightening process of clarification, the students would arrive at a suitable personal moral code all by themselves without adult guidance. Now, there is something obviously suspect in such an idea. Why bring up the subject of morals in a class if the teacher is not going to teach morality? Would that same teacher decide to bring up the subject of World War II and remain mute while the students in their ignorance discussed it? The implication is that you can teach history, but you cannot teach morals. Children must discover the latter for themselves. Can children come up with a well-thought-out personal set of values merely through a rap session on moral issues? I hardly think so, for the simple reason that children have simply not lived long enough or experienced enough to understand the serious ramifications of their naive juvenile decision-making. If this is what ordinary common sense tells us, then why do educators expect children to accomplish in a few classroom rap sessions what the world's greatest philosophers have been unable to do in a couple of thousand years? Obviously, a child comes to school with some idea of values. After all, a child learns very early in life what's important to him or her and what is not. But the child doesn't use the term values, which is really a philosophical abstraction. What is a value? According to my New World Dictionary of the American Language, it is that quality of a thing according to which it is thought of as being more or less desirable, useful, estimable, important, worthy of esteem for its own sake. We generally think of values in economic terms. Something that's expensive is considered of high value and is termed dear. The British sum up capitalism in 4 words: buy cheap, sell dear. Note how loaded these words are. Cheap not only connotes low price, but also shoddy merchandise. It also connotes low morals, a cheap trick, a cheap thrill. Dear connotes high price as well as emotional value, a dear friend, a dear mother. Children learn about values in emotional terms. Parents are dear because they are a source of love without which the child cannot survive. When children were asked in a survey what they wanted most, the answer was more time with their parents. And so children learn at home what is dear and what is not. They also learn that in matters of clothes, food, entertainment, etc., they have their likes and dislikes. Values or tastes are personal. De gustibus non est disputandum. You can't argue over taste. The idea that an educator can be value neutral is, of course, a sham. You have to be dead to be value neutral. The very condition of being alive requires value judgment if one is to survive. The body itself, from the moment of conception, values survival. In a film made of an actual abortion, the fetus could be seen on the sonar screen actually trying to get away from the abortionist's instrument. To a fetus, life is a value. In other words, the value of survival is imprinted in the genetic code of each human being. When an educator claims to be value neutral, you can be sure that he or she is not talking about economics. He or she is referring to moral values. The term moral values is a marvelous invention by humanists calculated to undermine the idea of absolute morality. By simply using the term, one accepts the notion of competing but equally valid moral codes. That's how you get a society to accept the unacceptable, by inventing a phrase that, when used in discourse, tacitly implies acceptance. The idea that several moral codes can coexist in one society is then touted as the essence of democracy: freedom of choice, freedom to kill the unborn, freedom not to kill the unborn. It is obvious that competing moral codes cannot coexist in a society without causing moral chaos. For example, the biblical moral code, which was the morality of our founding fathers, the moral code on which our institutions were built, regards premarital sex as immoral. Now, that didn't stop clandestine premarital affairs from occurring, but unwed motherhood was considered a cause for shame and was generally kept secret. The purpose of that moral code was to protect the integrity of marriage and the family, to protect women from the consequences of such behavior, to instill in young men a sense of responsibility in their romantic relationships, and to maintain a stable and healthy social order through marital fidelity and monogamy. In this regard, the biblical moral code calls for a healthy and logical course of behavior based on the natural order of things. Thus, boy first meets girl. Boy and girl then get to know one another. Boy and girl then fall in love. Their families then meet each other. Boy and girl get engaged. Boy and girl get married. Boy and girl, now man and wife, go on honeymoon, move in together, and have a family. The result is marital happiness, which is not as uncommon as we've been led to believe, social stability, economic productivity, and children raised in an atmosphere of emotional security and loving relationships. The alternative humanist moral code produces an entirely different scenario. That moral code is clearly spelled out in Humanist Manifesto 2 as follows, quote, "In the area of sexuality, we believe that intolerant attitudes, often cultivated by orthodox religions and puritanical cultures, unduly repress sexual conduct. The right to birth control, abortion, and divorce should be recognized. While we do not approve of exploitive, denigrating forms of sexual expression, neither do we wish to prohibit by law or social sanction sexual behavior between consenting adults. The many varieties of sexual exploration should not in themselves be considered evil. Without countenancing mindless permissiveness or unbridled promiscuity, a civilized society should be a tolerant one. Short of harming others or compelling them to do likewise, individuals should be permitted to express their sexual proclivities and pursue their lifestyles as they desire. We wish to cultivate the development of a responsible attitude towards sexuality in which humans are not exploited as sexual objects and in which intimacy, sensitivity, respect, and honesty in interpersonal relations are encouraged. Moral education for children and adults is an important way of developing awareness and sexual maturity," unquote. Note the important ideas in this manifesto. 1, there should be no laws or social sanctions against any form of sexual behavior between consenting adults. No restrictions whatever on sexual activity among consenting adults. The second point, a civilized society tolerates any and all sexual proclivities and lifestyles. If you're not tolerant, you are not civilized. But we have often heard that a civilized society cannot tolerate racial discrimination or racism. It cannot tolerate sexism, genderism. In other words, a civilized society should tolerate sexual aberration, but not racial discrimination. Why? The third point, or third idea, moral education should be used to develop toleration of every possible form of sexual experimentation, deviance, and behavior by consenting adults. But what about all of these children who are being taught to be so tolerant? When do they get a chance to engage in the sort of behavior they are being taught about? Must they wait until they are 16 or 18 or 21, whatever the consenting age is? Indeed, what kind of behavior flows from the sexual recipe in this Humanist Manifesto? Here's a scenario we've seen enacted time and time again. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl have sex. Girl gets pregnant. Her pregnancy causes a family crisis. She's not sure what to do. Boy leaves girl. Girl decides on an abortion. The trauma of the abortion remains with her forever. She picks up the emotional pieces of her life and looks for another boyfriend. Here's another scenario. Boy meets girl. Boy goes to guidance counselor in school clinic and gets condom. Condom fails. Girl gets pregnant. Girl decides to have the child live on welfare and raise the child without a father. She and her child will live in a state of near poverty until she finds someone who might marry her. Here's a more middle-class scenario. Boy meets girl. Girl enters into a meaningful relationship with her boyfriend. They live together, she gets pregnant and proposes they get married. But boy convinces her that they are not ready for marriage and that an abortion is the best solution. Girl has the abortion, becomes depressed, withholds sex from her boyfriend. Boy leaves girl for another meaningful relationship with the girl's best friend. Girl tries to commit suicide but botches the job. Modern liberal middle-class mother hands her daughter a diaphragm for her birthday. We could spend the rest of the day concocting an endless variety of scenarios, all ending up in one sort of tragedy or another. The humanists would contend that some of these premarital affairs actually end up in happy marriages. But what has acceptance of and tolerance for premarital sex given us? Widespread unwed motherhood, an epidemic of venereal diseases seriously affecting the health of millions of young people, the massive killing of the unborn, increased unhappiness and depression caused by failed romances, abandonment by lovers, infidelity, and empty, degrading sexual affairs. That's the legacy of the new sexual morality. Not exactly a recipe for human happiness. Clearly, what we have in America is a cultural civil war being fought not by armed regiments, but by adherents of competing moral codes. This civil war has created not only moral chaos, but judicial chaos. A moral code is enforced either by custom or by law, and a system of law that tries to reconcile such contradictory and irreconcilable moral customs and standards is doomed to fail. The confusion that besets society is particularly acute when dealing with such volatile subjects as homosexuality and deviant lifestyles. The biblical moral code to which most Americans adhere explicitly regards homosexuality not only as immoral, but as an abomination, a rather strong, visceral condemnation if there ever was one. But society's disapproval never stopped homosexuality from existing. It was practiced secretly out of public sight. But with the growing acceptance of the new morality among swinging heterosexuals in the 1960s, homosexuals began to assert their right to live their lifestyle openly and flagrantly. And the public generally acquiesced in the name of tolerance, that indispensable ingredient of a democratic society. The idea of religious tolerance was simply extended to cover sexual tolerance. The result was a tremendous increase in promiscuous behavior among homosexuals, which increased enormously the spread of venereal diseases among them, culminating in the germination and spread of the deadly AIDS virus, which, as of February 1991, has resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 individuals, 80% of them homosexuals. The Humanist Manifesto preaches sexual tolerance and the freedom of consenting adults to engage in any sexual activities they wish. The assumption is that if the activities are conducted among consenting adults, no harm can possibly come to anyone else. If only this were true. The AIDS epidemic has demonstrated how easily a blood bank can transport the infected blood of a promiscuous homosexual in Los Angeles to the veins of a hospital patient undergoing surgery in Denver. It has demonstrated how easy it is for a pregnant intravenous drug user infected by a contaminated needle to pass the AIDS virus to her unborn child. In other words, when a nation, in its magnanimity, tolerates perverse behavior, it pays a price it may not have anticipated. The humanists give the impression that the biblical moral code is unduly repressive and intolerant for totally arbitrary and unjustifiable reasons. it is assumed that the Puritans disliked sex and all other forms of carnality because they were cold-blooded, cold-hearted sticks in the mud, paralyzed by superstition and the fear of a monstrous, angry, mythical figure called Jehovah. But when one examines the biblical moral code objectively, one finds in it the most reasonable, logical guide to a healthy, happy life one is likely to find anywhere. Clearly, it is a moral code based on a profound understanding of human nature and human experience. It is unlikely, for example, that the AIDS plague is something new. Such plagues probably existed in ancient times among pagans whose sexual practices were similar to those practiced today by the adherents of the new morality. 2,000 years of sexual repression based on the tenets of the Ten Commandments simply eradicated most of these plagues. But now they are back because the old practices are back. Where did this destructive new morality come from? It came from a profoundly atheistic intellectual elite who adopted Freud's dictum that sexual repression is bad for your health. Of course, if that were true, Catholic priests would be the sickest people in America. In 1933, the Humanist Manifesto championed for all Americans the sort of moral freedom which artists and writers in Greenwich Village had long enjoyed as one of the benefits of bohemian life. It took Hugh Hefner, with his newly launched Playboy magazine, to bring that hedonist philosophy to the business executive and university student. Artists and writers were no longer the privileged class. Middle-class America was now told that the forbidden fruit was now available to just about everyone at popular prices. But something else happened, something else had been going on at a deeper level to prepare America for its transformation into Sodom and Gomorrah. The battering ram against biblical morality was not only the Humanist Manifesto, but the new humanistic psychology, otherwise known as the Third Force. This new psychology was principally the work of a brilliant young psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who, working with the best of intentions and highest of moral aims, brought into being the human potential movement, which has led millions of Americans into moral and spiritual chaos. Maslow, born in New York in 1908 of a Jewish immigrant family, rejected religion early in life because he associated it with a mother he detested. He wrote in later years, quote, "I always wondered where my utopianism, ethical stress, humanism, stress on kindness, love, friendship, and all the rest came from. I know certainly of the direct consequences of having no mother love. But the whole thrust of my life philosophy and all my research and theorizing also has its roots in a hatred for and revulsion against everything she stood for," unquote. By the time Maslow was a teenager, he regarded all religion as nonsensical. To him, religious observance attracted only the naive and the hypocritical. Later in high school, a teacher introduced him to the novels of Upton Sinclair, which turned him into a socialist. Eugene Debs, Norman Thomas, and other prominent American socialists became his heroes. In 1928, Maslow chose psychology as his career after reading several essays by John B. Watson, the father of American behaviorism. "I suddenly saw unrolling before me into the future," he wrote, "the possibility of a science of psychology, a program of work which promised real progress, real advance, real solutions of real problems. All that was necessary was devotion and hard work." Watson's anti-religious outlook strongly appealed to Maslow, who shared Watson's faith in rationality as the means to a better society. Maslow was particularly taken in by Watson's optimistic belief in the malleability of human nature. Change the environment and you can change human nature, argued Watson. However, it was through his field work with the Blackfoot Indians in Montana in the 1930s that Maslow began to revise his behaviorist views. He wrote, quote, "It would seem that every human being comes at birth into society not as a lump of clay to be molded by society, but rather as a structure which society may warp or suppress or build upon. I am now struggling with a notion of a fundamental or natural personality structure," unquote. But it was the birth of his daughter in 1938 that made Maslow reject behaviorism altogether. As he watched his little daughter assert her wants and dislikes, the idea that a child could be molded into anything the psychologist wanted through behavioral conditioning became untenable. He wrote, quote, "Becoming a father changed my whole life. It made the behaviorism I had been so enthusiastic about look so foolish that I couldn't stomach it anymore," unquote. He's a very emotional guy, this Maslow. In 1943, Maslow formulated his own theory of human motivation. He centered his theory on what he called the hierarchy of human needs. He contended that every person is born with a set of basic needs, such as food, safety, love, self-esteem. But when these basic needs are satisfied, there is a higher need that cries for satisfaction, self-actualization. He wrote, quote, "A musician must make music, an artist must paint, a poet must write, if he is to be ultimately at peace with himself. What a man can be, he must be. This need we may call self-actualization," unquote. Maslow had rejected Freud's pessimistic view of human nature and the behaviorist's animalistic view of man. He had come up with a third view of his own. He was much more interested in human success than in human failure. Maslow's biographer, Edward Hoffman, writes, quote, "The issue was no longer what makes for a genius like Beethoven, but why aren't we all Beethovens?" Slowly and unexpectedly, Maslow's self-actualization research had become the basis for an entirely new vision of psychology, with the premise that each of us harbors an innate human nature of vast potential that usually becomes blocked or thwarted through the deprivation of lower needs. This inner potential, Maslow believed, had not been taken into account by any existing school of psychology. He emphasized that true fulfillment in life comes from satisfying our higher needs, especially the need for self-actualization. The more we pursue and realize our loftier needs, Maslow contended, the happier and even physically healthier we will be, unquote. Maslow himself wrote, quote, "I think of the self-actualizing man not as an ordinary man with something added, but rather as an ordinary man with nothing taken away. The average man is a human being with dampened and inhibited powers," unquote. In short, Maslow had come up with another secular recipe for human perfectibility, in complete contradiction to the biblical view of man's fallen nature. It is said that Maslow had a messiah complex with a great personal mission to change the human condition. He said in 1955, quote, "I am also very definitely interested and concerned with man's fate, with his ends and goals, and with his future. I would like to help improve him and to better his prospects. I hope to help teach him how to be brotherly, cooperative, peaceful, courageous, and just. I think science is the best hope for achieving this, and of all the sciences, I consider psychology most important to this end. Indeed, I sometimes think that the world will either be saved by psychologists, in the very broadest sense, or else it will not be saved at all," unquote. In other words, humanistic psychology offered mankind a new atheistic road to salvation, and one of the mechanisms or techniques which the psychologists or humanistic clergy would use to bring salvation to the individual is the encounter group, the intensive group experience. The encounter experience was first developed at the National Training Laboratory in Bethel, Maine, sponsored by the National Education Association. It was founded in 1947 by Kurt Lewin, a German social psychologist who invented sensitivity training and group dynamics, or the psychology of the collective. Lewin's work was very much in harmony with John Dewey's educational philosophy, which stressed socialization. The man most responsible for joining the encounter movement with humanistic psychology was Carl Rogers, the founder of non-directive psychological counseling. In non-directive counseling or teaching, the therapist or teacher is merely a facilitator who helps the client or pupil get in touch with his own feelings so that he can direct his own decision-making in accordance with his own values. In teaching, this encourages moral subjectivism and pupil rejection of all outside authority. Rogers became the guru of the encounter movement because of his extensive experimentation with the technique at the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute at La Jolla, California. In a lecture to an audience of educators in 1968, Rogers described the function of the encounter group. Quote, "One of the most effective means yet discovered for facilitating constructive learning and growth and change in individuals and in the organization they represent is the intensive group experience. It goes by many names: encounter group, T group, sensitivity training. The intensive group or encounter group usually consists of 10 to 15 persons and a facilitator or leader. Personally, I prefer the term facilitator because I think he really helps to facilitate the group in its own direction. It's a relatively unstructured group providing a climate of maximum freedom for personal expression, exploration of feelings, and interpersonal communication," unquote. The first sensitivity training program for educational leaders was conducted by the National Training Laboratory in 1959. It was sponsored by the National Association of Elementary School Principals. The program was designed for the principal as an agent and manager of change. You've heard of the change agent. Rogers wrote, quote, "Changingness, a reliance on process rather than upon static knowledge, is the only thing that makes any sense as a goal for education in the modern world," unquote. Why all the emphasis on change? Well, because the humanists realized that there was something terribly wrong with public education and that it had to be changed. They beat the conservatives to the punch in that respect. Rogers wrote in 1971, quote, "I have days when I think educational institutions at all levels are doomed. I also have moments when it seems that if we could only do away with the state-required curricula, compulsory attendance, tenured professors, hours of lectures, grades, degrees, and all that, perhaps everybody would move outside the stifling hallowed walls and learning could flourish on its own," unquote. Who could argue with that? But Rogers' dream was only a dream. Schools were here to stay, and the humanists were determined to remake them in their own image. Arthur Combs wrote, quote, "There are 100 ways we dehumanize people in our schools, and we need to make a systematic attempt to get rid of them. If we want to humanize the process of learning, we must make a systematic search for the things that destroy effective learning and remove them from the scene. If we're going to humanize the processes of learning, we must take the student in as a partner. Education wouldn't be irrelevant if students had a voice in decision-making," unquote. One must admit that the humanist critique had merit. Public education was every bit as bad as they said it was. But would sensitivity training, values clarification, and encounter groups make it better or worse? In 1971, John Silber, who later became president of Boston University, wrote, quote, "Encounter groups invade human privacy with reckless abandon. You cannot make public what is private without changing it. We have derived our sense of human dignity largely from the Judeo-Christian tradition and to some extent from the Hellenic tradition. In rejecting those traditions, we forfeit the basis for the respect of the individual person and his dignity. I question the claim that encounter sessions have therapeutic value. Some group sessions have caused great harm. bringing people over the brink, exacerbating mental difficulties and problems that were relatively under control before the students participated in encounter sessions, unquote. What Silber suggested is that the encounter group was the humanists' equivalent of the prayer meeting. And there is no doubt that what Maslow and Rogers were offering America was a new religion in which self-actualization replaced salvation as the ultimate meaning and goal of life. But how does all of this work in the classroom today? Humanistic psychology has been so widely accepted, so deeply absorbed, and institutionalized by the educational system that the educators themselves see it as the system's underlying philosophy. And that is why affective education is considered the indispensable part of the public school curriculum. Why? Because it deals with values, beliefs, feelings, and behavior. As Arthur Combs has said, quote, "Modern education must produce far more than persons with cognitive skills. It must produce humane individuals. We can live with a bad reader. A bigot is a danger to everyone," unquote. We can live with a bad reader. We could live with illiteracy, but we can't live with bigotry. What is needed, he said, is a humanistic psychology expressly designed to deal with the human aspects of personality and behavior, a psychology which does not ignore the students' belief systems, but makes them central to its concerns. Now, when I was going to elementary school back in the 1930s, the last thing the teacher was concerned with were my feelings or belief system. She didn't want to know how I felt or what I felt. She simply wanted to know if I was learning what she was teaching. Affective education has opened the schoolhouse door to every sort of lunacy the humanists can dream up. So now we not only have sex education, sensitivity training, and values clarification, but also death education, drug education, magic circles, role-playing, transcendental meditation, yoga, Eastern religion, etc. One widely used technique for clarifying values in the classroom is the lifeboat survival game or fallout shelter game. I was given the instruction sheet for the latter exercise by a parent in Clarkston, Washington, a couple of years ago. It was used in the 9th grade at the local high school. 9th graders are about 14 or 15 years old, and I had a copy of that particular sheet reproduced so that all of you can see what those 9th graders had to deal with. The lesson is entitled, "Who Should Survive?" And the instructions read, quote, "The following 15 persons are in a bomb shelter after a nuclear war. These 15 persons are the only humans left on Earth. It will take 6 weeks for the external radiation level to drop to a safe survival level. The food supplies in the shelter can sustain at a very minimum level 7 persons for 6 weeks. It is your task to decide which persons will survive. Be prepared to justify your choices," unquote. First of all, notice how the problem is rigged. The title is "Who Should Survive," not "Who Will Survive." How do these 15 persons know that they are the only human beings left on Earth? How do they know that it will take 6 weeks for the outside radiation level to fall? If they have that kind of scientific knowledge, maybe they also have somewhere in that bunker a radiation-proof suit that one of the survivors can put on and find adequate food somewhere on the outside. Also, who among the survivors has the right to decide who is to live and who is to die? None of these questions are brought up. Instead, these 15-year-olds are now supposed to play God and sentence 8 people to death in a situation which could easily be changed with a little imagination and resourcefulness. Here are the 15 persons. 1, Dr. Dame, 39, white, no church affiliation, PhD in history, college professor, good health, married, 1 child, active and enjoys politics. 2, Mrs. Dame, 38, white, Jew, MA in psychology, counselor in mental health clinic, good health, married, one child, active in community. 3, Bobby Dame, 10, white, Jew, special education classes for 4 years, mentally retarded, IQ 70, good health, enjoys his pets. Well, you know immediately that he's a candidate for elimination. I mean, his parents are obviously humanists. Pop's a PhD, Mom's an MA, so they'll do the humanist thing and kill little Bobby. 4, Mrs. Garcia, 33, Spanish-American, Roman Catholic, 9th grade education, cocktail waitress, prostitute, good health, married at 16, divorced at 18, abandoned as a child, in a foster home as a youth, attacked by foster parent at age 12, ran away from home, returned to reformatory, stayed until 16, one child, 3 weeks old. This guy should be writing soap operas. 5, Jean Garcia, 3 weeks old, Spanish-American, good health, nursing for food. Well, you can see that Mrs. Garcia and her infant are also obvious candidates for elimination. She's only a cocktail waitress and a prostitute. Maybe if she had an MA or PhD, she'd have a better chance of surviving, but with only a 9th grade education, she's a goner. Six, Mrs. Evans, 32, Negro, Protestant, AB, MA in elementary education, teacher, divorced, one child, good health, cited as outstanding teacher, enjoys working with children. 7, Mary Evans, 8, Negro, Protestant, 3rd grade, good health, excellent student. Well, Mrs. Evans sounds like a strong lady that nobody, but nobody will want to touch. She's been cited as an outstanding teacher, which is supposed to impress the kids playing God. They will no doubt also spare her daughter, you see. Next, number 8, John Jacobs, 13, white Protestant, 8th grade, honor student, very active, broad interest, father is a Baptist minister, good health. Well, the kids in the class will no doubt identify with this character, so he's safe. They're not going to kill themselves, you see. 9, Mr. Newton, 25, Negro, claims to be an atheist, was in last year of medical school until suspended for homosexual activity. Good health, seems bitter concerning racial problems, wears hippie clothes. Well, we know that that's a setup if there ever was one. A black homosexual who wears hippie clothes? He's a goner. But what about tolerance in the brave new world? Can the new humanist society do without this individual who represents cultural diversity and enrichment? 10, Mrs. Clark, 28, Negro, Protestant, college grad, engineering, electronics engineer, married, no children, good health, enjoys outdoor sports and stereo equipment, grew up in ghetto. Well, another strong black female. Dr. Dame is going to have a bit of a problem. Undoubtedly, he's going to be the facilitator. And he's got 2 strong black women to contend with. 11, Sister Mary Kathleen, 27, a nun. College grad, English major, grew up in upper middle class neighborhood, good health, father, a businessman. Well, she's going to have to undergo a rapid cultural change in order to survive. 12, Mr. Blake, 51, white, Mormon, high school graduate, mechanic, Mr. Fix-It, married, 4 children, not with him, good health, enjoys outdoors and working in his shop. Well, who knows what the kids will decide to do with Mr. Blake. 13, Miss Harris, 21, Spanish-American, Protestant, college senior, nursing major, good health, enjoys sports, likes people. Well, she's obviously a good candidate for survival. 14, Father France, 37, white, Catholic, college plus seminary, priest, active in civil rights, criticized for liberal views, good health, former college athlete. I believe the kids will probably decide that there isn't going to be much need for a priest in the New World. 15, Dr. Gonzalez, 66, Spanish-American, Catholic, medical doctor, general practitioner, has had 2 heart attacks in the past 5 years, but continues to practice. Well, he's too old and too sick. Good opening for a discussion on euthanasia. Well, that completes our cast of characters, and now we can start clarifying our values. I can imagine the students deciding to get rid of the easy ones first. Bobby Dame, the mentally retarded Jewish boy, and Dr. Gonzalez, who will probably have his 3rd heart attack before the 6 weeks are up. It's interesting to note that in Hitler's Germany, Nazi doctors decided that the mentally defective was socially worthless and should therefore be killed. This practice started in the 1930s and was a mere prelude to the Holocaust that would take place during the war. 2 more easy victims are Mrs. Garcia, the ex-prostitute, and her nursing infant. The 5th will no doubt be the black homosexual atheist who wears hippie clothes. He's hardly the type you'd want to help generate a new human race. So far it's been pretty easy, but we have 3 more to go. Dr. and Mrs. Dame look pretty safe. He's got a PhD and she's got an MA, which means that they can start a graduate school of education as soon as they crawl out of the shelter. Goodness knows the 7 survivors will need one to help create this new world order. Mrs. Evans, the 32-year-old black teacher, and her 8-year-old daughter look safe. Mrs. Evans has an AB and an MA in elementary education, which means that the education establishment will have survived the nuclear holocaust. John Jacobs, the 13-year-old white boy, is a shoo-in. The kids in the class will certainly identify with him. Mrs. Clark, the 28-year-old black electronics engineer, will probably be spared because she's good at repairing stereo equipment. Sister Mary Kathleen, the 27-year-old nun, is obviously a loser unless she's willing to give up her virginity. Mr. Blake, the Mormon mechanic. Mr. Blake, the Mormon mechanic, is a little too old, all of 51. Besides, he doesn't have a college degree. Miss Harris, the 21-year-old Hispanic nursing major, looks good as a future breeder of children. Father France, the 37-year-old priest, is a problem. Maybe the kids will permit him to live if he gives up his celibacy. Tough decisions for the kids to make. And of course, this exercise has afforded the children the opportunity to discuss such subjects as infanticide, mercy killing, euthanasia, homosexuality, rape, prostitution, interracial marriage, religion, ethnic differences, etc. Incidentally, this cast of characters tells us much about the values of the educator who dreamed it up. If you will notice, 5 of the 15 persons are white males. The 1 black male is a homosexual, and the 1 Hispanic male is old and sick. So only white males will survive. Of the 5 white males, the PhD, the 13-year-old boy, and either the Mormon mechanic or the priest will be among the final winners. Did you ever doubt that the PhD would survive? As for the females, the situation is fraught with social and racial overtones. The exercise starts with 8 females, 2 whites, the master of psychology and the nun, 3 blacks, the MA in elementary education and her daughter and the electronics engineer, and 3 Hispanics, the prostitute and her baby and the student nurse. After eliminating the prostitute and her baby, the kids will have to eliminate 2 more females. Who will they be? The nun, 1 or both of the strong black females, the Hispanic student nurse, or the master of psychology? Maybe Dr. Dame will take a shine to 1 of the black females and decide that Mrs. Dame, the lone surviving Jew, is dispensable. Who needs a Jewish problem in the brave new world? Or maybe the Mormon mechanic and the 13-year-old boy will decide to solve the race problem once and for all by eliminating the 3 black females. Why start off a new world and a new human race with a race problem? The possibilities are positively enticing. And then, of course, there is the real joker in all of this. Once Dr. Gonzalez knows that he is on the humanist hit list, he may decide that this is grossly unfair. And wouldn't you know that the good doctor, in preparation for such contingencies, has a supply of cyanide in his possession, and with a little deft maneuvering may manage to poison everyone in the bunker he dislikes. Well, have your values been sufficiently clarified? Can you imagine the emotional turmoil and confusion such an exercise can cause in the minds and hearts of the 15-year-olds who are forced to deal with it? The exercise clarifies nothing. It's a kind of moral masturbation that humanists love to engage in. It confuses the whole issue of values. Above all, it tells you that there is something sick in an educational system that conducts education in this perverse, depressing, idiotic way. Incidentally, when I was given this class exercise by the parent in Clarkson and read it, I complained about it in a press interview. I thought it was pretty awful. The principal of the high school was informed of my complaint. He defended the assignment as one that teaches the students, quote, the process one goes through in making choices, unquote. He said that the exercise was not unrealistic in this age of nuclear issues, and that not to discuss such issues would be a disservice to the students. Think about that for a moment. The principal would have us believe that it is perfectly realistic for children to think of themselves as one of 15 sole survivors in a worldwide nuclear holocaust. Statistically, it is far more likely that any one of these students will win the state lottery or the Irish sweepstakes than find himself or herself among the last 15 human beings alive. So why not give the children an exercise in deciding what they would do with $15 million if they won it in a lottery? It would be a lot more fun, a lot more realistic, for hundreds of people in America have actually faced that problem, and a lot healthier than ordering the executions of 8 survivors of a nuclear holocaust. One would think that in such a situation, every human being would be precious enough to want to save. There are only 15 left. Every human being would be precious. But humanists don't think that way. Incidentally, there was an article in the paper about a lottery ticket. Somebody won $16 million. They can't find him, though. But he won 60. He'll have a problem with $16 million. I believe that what makes humanism and humanistic psychology so malevolent, so destructive, is their profound atheism. An atheism not based on indifference toward God, but hatred and defiance. It is not insignificant that what drove Maslow in search of the holy secular grail was the hatred he had for his mother and everything he thought she represented. He never forgave her. He refused to attend her funeral. Yet toward the end of his life, he could see that he had made some serious mistakes in his psychological scheme. He could see that all of these students who were well-fed and had all of their basic needs satisfied weren't interested in higher needs. None of them became these great people that he thought they'd become once their basic needs were satisfied. But by then his ideas had been absorbed by so many hedonists and pagans and lunatics that the damage could never be undone. And so the Civil War continues. How will it end? No one knows. However, there is a faint silver lining off in the distance. The homeschool movement, which grows stronger by the day, indicates that many families in America are willing to take matters into their own hands when it comes to the education of their own children. Their abandonment of the public school represents a radical break with the cultural and statist norms of our society. Something fundamental is taking place when thousands of citizens abandon institutions that were once considered sacred. The only solution to this conflict over values is to restore full educational freedom in America, to get the government out of the education business, thereby diminishing the political and economic power of the education establishment, and to repeal the compulsory attendance laws which make our youngsters into virtual prisoners of the state for 12 years. When people argue that without compulsory attendance, some children will not go to school, I reply that no school is better than public school. I feel sad in having to say this because I went to public schools and got a fairly decent education. But that was half a century ago. Things are different today, and we must move forward. Frankly, I am convinced that public education is doomed. It is a sick dinosaur, destined for extinction. It no longer works, and it only survives because of its political power. What value is there in a system that doesn't work and can't work? Recently, John Gatto, who was named New York City's Teacher of the Year, appeared before a hearing in which he castigated the school system for, quote, the murder of 1 million black and Latino children, unquote. He got a standing ovation. This country has indeed reached a point of decision, but the decision isn't being made by the educators or our political leaders. It is being made every day by parents who now know that there is no other way to change things. And that's the way it will probably be for many years to come. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for questions. Do we still have some time? Is there time for? Okay. Yes, sir.
The last time you spoke here several years ago in this program and you discussed many of the questions that you've discussed tonight, another speaker on the program following, himself a specialist in many of the areas and issues that you raised, said quite frankly that you were full of nonsense and didn't know what you were talking about. Now, let me carry forward with that. I suspect that in this room tonight, there are some public school teachers who, in working with their children, work from a set of values which you yourself would espouse. That is, they agree with your values. And they work very hard in their classrooms, and they do not believe in this humanistic education garbage. You cited the New York teacher who stood up and in that statement, if quoted in context, was condemning the system of which he was a part.
Yes.
And yet, your remarks tonight will be interpreted by many of these teachers as an attack upon them as classroom teachers. And I think, indeed, if I were a public school teacher, I would feel that way myself. Now, there is a problem in public education. It is not in the teachers, not in all of them. But you have not tonight said where that problem is. And I think that you owe it to this audience to say where it is.
All right. Well, the problem is with the philosophy of education. John Gatto, who was named Teacher of the Year, has written quite eloquently about why it is impossible for him to do a good job. Why teachers become an accomplice to the system because it's virtually impossible the way the system is constructed. And I'm not just talking about philosophy, I'm talking about the entire structure of public education or formal education as it now works today in the United States. That it doesn't do the job and is destructive to so many of these young people in the schools. He's spent 35 years in the schools, and that's the conclusion he's come to. He's a conservative. He's done everything in his power to do good by these youngsters, and yet the system is so overpowering that he considers his own contribution to be very, very limited. And he's a good man. And yes, there are many good teachers struggling every day, trying to do their best in a system that prevents them from doing their best. Thank God that we have those teachers in the schools that can save some youngsters and can give them some hope. I mean, I'm delighted and I'm happy that they are there, and I know they're there. But I'm simply saying when you look at the system as a whole, there's no hope for it. First of all, it's an anachronism. It's obsolete. It's a 19th century invention. We're now on the threshold of the 21st century. The trends are now toward decentralization and privatization for the free market economies of the West. The reason why the Soviet Union can't change is because they've got that ossified Communist Party and bureaucracies that are standing in the way. And the reason why education is not progressing in this country is because we've got this ossified system that stands in the way. And I have been studying this system now for over 20 years, and I know it from top to bottom, and I know it in the nitty-gritty of how they teach reading to little children and turn out functional illiterates by the million. Sure, there are some good teachers there who are trying to do their job, but look at the damage that is being caused. That this country should have a reading problem and a literacy problem when we spend billions on education is unconscionable. Well, yeah, sure, you can. Yeah, go ahead. Wait, he wants to get the microphone. The microphone.
Yeah, I think they can hear you.
But
Would you be in favor of doing away with all teachers' colleges in this country?
What a wonderful idea.
With the certification requirements as they now stand. So that if anyone with a bona fide degree in a subject area wanted to attempt to teach in a public school, that person would be given the right to at least attempt to do so.
Well,
I'm saying the teachers, what I wanted from you and I didn't get,
yeah.
because I think you're a product of the teachers' colleges, are you not?
No, I never attended
All
a
right.
teachers' college.
I am persuaded that the present system of training and certifying teachers in America is the base disease in American education. That plus the public school monopoly.
Yeah.
But it is the educators themselves who are the problem.
Oh, yes, I agree with you that, and I've written about that extensively, that the problem starts with your colleges of education, your graduate schools of education, that are training all of these teachers and producing teachers who can teach, who want to teach, but they don't know how to teach because they're not being properly instructed. And of course, these graduate schools have all been taken over by humanistic psychology. Why do you think the affective domain is so important in today's schools? You know, in today's public schools, the curriculum is divided into two parts. You have the cognitive domain and the affective domain. The cognitive domain refers to such subjects as reading, writing, and arithmetic. But if you understand what they've done to reading, writing, and arithmetic, that they're teaching children to read English as if it were Chinese. They're not teaching them to write well. They're teaching them, invented spelling. They don't teach them how to spell anymore. Now they can make it up. They went through the new math. Now they got rid of that new math. We call that the old new math. Now they have a new math, where the kids now have to, they're going to use computers and calculators. They don't have to memorize anything anymore. No drill, no drudgery, you see. So that's what they've done to the cognitive domain. They're producing kids who know nothing, come out with empty heads, and then they put all their emphasis on the affective domain, and that is the religious content of the curriculum. That's the humanistic religious content of that curriculum. The public school is every bit a parochial school as any Catholic school. It's a humanistic institution, and that affective domain is pure, unadulterated humanism. You see. So you've got a system that is so nuts, so insane that it couldn't possibly be saved no matter how many good teachers are still there, because those good teachers do not make the policies, they don't write the textbooks, they have to do what they're told to do by the superintendents. And I've been involved in so many different disputes over textbooks and reading programs and values clarification and sex education. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. It'll go on forever that way as long as we keep paying for it.
You spoke of a connection with Freud earlier, like a possible German connection, and if that's the problem with our present-day dilemma, our moral dilemma. Would you, to remedy this situation, would you emphasize getting back to the principles found within the American founding, or would you say that in tracing our political and intellectual lineage back to Locke and other philosophers of the Enlightenment, egalitarianism, self-preservation, natural rights, that our present-day situation is the inevitable outcome of our founding?
Well, our present-day situation is the outcome of our founding. I mean, our founding fathers were brilliant men who produced a system which, of course, had to be put into action by human beings. The problem is not with the Enlightenment, it's with the Garden of Eden. It goes way back, goes further than that, you see. We're dealing with fallen man. You're dealing with a sinful nature. You're dealing with what Calvin so beautifully described as man's innate depravity, you see. That's what you're dealing with. So even the best of systems will be perverted because human beings are that way. Now, our founding fathers wanted to prevent that perversion from occurring the way it has, say, in Soviet Russia or in China. They felt that by breaking up power into the smallest units, no single person could get so much power like a Saddam Hussein so that he could, you know, be able to own the country practically. They understood human frailties. The founding fathers understood human nature better than any other, you might say, statesman that ever lived. And they were very biblically based. Most of them were Calvinists. And they understood man's sinful, depraved nature, and they said that the only way that society, civilization can exist is if men live under God's law and obey His commandments and restrain themselves and control themselves. But when you throw off the controls, when you throw off God's law, God's commandments, what do you have? You have what we're seeing today, you see. And so what is the solution? The only solution is to go back to those precepts, to those principles that permit men to lead decent, happy lives, productive lives. And you can do that if you follow the biblical commandments. And remember, the biblical commandments are the basis of our law. There's no dispute between our basic law, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, with the biblical commandments. There's no dispute whatever. So yes, there are all sorts of ideas which have undermined this basic foundation, and I suppose this will go on forever. But the point is that we should realize when things have to be changed, and they are changing. We cannot stop those parents from removing their kids from the schools that are failed and creating whole new institutions in America. That's the way it's going to happen. If leaders are not going to do it, then the people themselves will do it.
Okay, let me just 2 more questions real quick. Let's take them to Susan.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I was interested in your exposition on the home schools. I have several friends who were educated in the homeschool movement. They seem to have turned out very well, and I have a lot of respect for the parents who will do that. I'm wondering how practical it is, though, on a widespread basis, especially considering parents do have to work, especially in light of the fact the government's going to take 40% of their income. And many of them may not have the educational background themselves to do the job right, necessarily. Isn't what you've presented tonight maybe more so an argument that education belongs vested where it was for 1,500 years, namely in the church?
Well, that's a very good observation. It's true that when this country was started, education was mainly what was virtually totally private. You had tutors, you had church schools, you had private academies, and you had homeschooling. George Washington was homeschooled. The founding fathers, for the most part, were schooled at home. They learned certainly the basics at home. Higher education was very limited. Literacy was very high. We don't need this incredible structure. It's really not needed. We've just grown accustomed to it, you see. And over a period of time, we begin to feel that we can't do without it. But why do so many young people drop out? Why do so many people leave the system? Because they can't stand it. Why do they burn down the schools? Why do they vandalize them? Because they realize that the schools have become a source of harm to them. They don't love the schools. I mean, in my day, we respected the teachers. We respected the schools. You didn't litter. You had a relationship with the teacher. You sat in a chair, a desk and a chair that was bolted to the floor. Everything was neat. No Mickey Mouse in the room. Of course, this was before Mickey Mouse. No cartoons. Today you go into the American classroom, it's all baby. It's all babyfied. You think you're in a nursery. Every inch of the wall is plastered with some cartoon, some animal, Goofy, you know. And the symbol of knowledge is Mickey Mouse. You know, there's a Mickey Mouse encyclopedia. And he's got the, you know, the hat, and he's pointing with a stick, and the children are supposed to look at Mickey Mouse as their model of an intellectual. See, what's happened to America is the symbol for romance and love is a rabbit, a bunny, the Playboy bunny, and the symbol for intellect is a mouse. That's what's happened to America. So our problems are pretty deep. And homeschooling is, I haven't seen any, you know, I haven't seen any mice representing learning in the home school. Now, of course, that's not a solution for everyone. There are many good church schools, but even they have to learn how to do things in the right way. And there's so many different kinds of schools, but the church is going to have to get much more involved in education. As a matter of fact, I believe that one of the reasons why we have these problems in America is because of the failure of the Christian ministers to stand up and recognize that these public schools are destroying the souls of millions of children, Christian children. And you know, they're Christian parents who put their children in public schools, and they go to church on Sunday, but the kids go to public schools, and then some of them get on dope, drugs, get pregnant, all sorts of things happen, and then they say, what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? Well, if you put a Christian child in an atheist school for 6 hours a day, for 5 days a week, for 12 years, what do you expect? You know, I don't know why they're surprised. And I don't know why Christian ministers don't warn their congregations, hey, do you know that if you put your Christian children in atheist, satanic schools run by humanistic psychologists, do you know what you might get? But no, you see, the Christian minister is much more concerned with respectability. He wants to be able to hobnob with the school board and the mayor and all the powers that be in town. He doesn't want to rock the boat. And that's the reason why the flock is wandering. The flock is not taking care of its children.
Thank you for an excellent talk, but with all due respect, I think I missed something. I think I missed the value at issue when you discussed premarital sex and biblical law versus the Humanist Manifesto #2. It seemed to me that you weren't discussing the actual inherent value, the goodness or badness of the act of premarital sex, but rather its effects on society. Biblical law was good because it eliminated venereal disease and promoted the family, and humanist views are bad because they lead to AIDS and unwed mothers. This seems to me to be utilitarianism, not values, and I would ask you, in light of this, how would you do you determine values by evaluating their effects, or how do you determine actual values and goodness or badness of things?
Well, that's a very good point. You make an excellent point. You know, I'm not writing a book on the subject. I'm limited in what I can say and what things I can bring out. And I wanted to just show from the humanist point of view, the pure utilitarian, as you'd say, results of these crazy of the moral issues that we have, what it does to society, let alone the individual. I did talk about human happiness. I did dwell on that to some degree, but I did want to show, however, how logical and sensible and reasonable biblical law is, in spite of the fact that some people think that it's some horrible imposition, that the people who wrote the Bible were just killjoys. You know, they didn't like any of this stuff. That was the point I wanted to make, basically, that biblical law is very sensible, that even those people who don't believe in God should find it very sensible and meaningful and of course, healthful. And I wanted to show the consequences of departing from biblical law. The consequences are very real, not only to the individual, but to the society as a whole. That was the point I wanted to make. But of course, you can't say everything in one talk. But in any case, I want to thank you all for your attention. You've been a delightful audience. Thank you.